Well, hi. It's great to be here. It's great to see all of you here. And oops, never mind. Always something. There we go. That might be a little bit more sensible. Anyway, it's great to see all of you here. And it's great to be here. And I noticed in the pre-show chat, some people mentioned that today is the feast of the most precious blood, which it is. One very wonderful feast day. So before I begin today's show, I think you all know what today's show is about. It's more hammering at the blue pill of Darwinism. But before I start, you know, my commission for all that I do is to generate prayers for the conversion of the Jews. That's what I consider my primary mission. And so I'm going to use the excuse of it being the feast of the most precious blood to solicit some prayers for the conversion of the Jews. So let me show you this very beautiful prayer, which is written by Pope Pius XI and inserted in the liturgy for the Feast of Christ the King. And forgive me if I've mentioned this before on the show, but it is turning around the curse that the Jews brought down on themselves, so to speak, for having crucified Christ, and reversing it into a blessing. And the words of the prayer are, "Of old the Jews called down upon themselves the blood of the Savior. May it now descend upon them as a shower of redemption and life." So since the feast of the most precious blood, the feast of that shower of blood that poured forth from the side of Jesus, let's take advantage of the opportunity to pray that God, in his mercy, reverse that self-imprecation, that curse, and turn the most precious blood of Jesus that the Jews call down upon themselves. Let him interpret them calling it down upon themselves as a prayer for the redemption and life that flows from the precious blood of Jesus to pour down on the Jewish people. So that's my commercial, so to speak. And with that, I'll get back to the show. Okay. So it looks like you can hear me because I'm not seeing any complaints. So as I said, the purpose of this episode and the last couple of episodes was how important it is to get the idea of evolution actually out of our heads. And I spent the last two shows talking about a lot of reasons why the theory of evolution doesn't hold water. I'm not going to repeat that. But the focus of today's show is I think, a very pernicious, I don't know what to call it, position that's held by many in the Catholic Church, unfortunately many in the hierarchy, that's called theistic evolution. Before I get on to what theistic evolution is, and why I would argue it's actually more ridiculous to believe in theistic evolution than to believe in Darwinian evolution if you're an atheist. If you believe in God, if you believe in the dogmas of the Catholic faith, then it makes no sense at all to believe in theistic evolution, because the only purpose of theistic evolution is to basically be able to accept as a proven fact the fact of evolution, and then try to squeeze God in sideways. Anyway, that'll be today's show, so I'm not going to get ahead of myself. Why is it so important to debunk and deprogram belief in evolution? I think I brought up this slide before, but basically, evolution was absolutely necessary for the zeitgeist, for the kind of corporate mentality of culture to decide or to accept the idea that there's no God, to accept the idea of atheism. Now, once you put God out of the equation, that God didn't create man, that God is not judging man, that man does not live forever and is responsible for what he does in the eyes of God, there's really very little reason for any morality or any avoidance of sin, especially of victimless sin, so to speak, such as sexual sin, which of course is not victimless, but let's pretend it is for the moment. And so we see what we see today, which is the absolute wholesale embrace of sin, even the teaching of sin as virtue, as you know. Just think of the few things that you can get, fired for, basically. If you think there's more than, if you think there are only two sexes, for instance, that's grounds for being fired and so forth. If you think there's anything wrong with sodomy, that's grounds for being fired. And of course, the consequence of this embrace of sin by society is that God is going to have to give a wake-up call or punishment or chastisement or wrap things up with a second coming and make it the end of the world. Because he can't let, he doesn't create human souls for hell, so he's just not in the business of allowing sin to take over society entirely. And all of that was totally dependent on the propagation of the theory of evolution and the acceptance of the theory of evolution as a fact. So I'm don't remember whether I have a slide saying this, but basically, okay, before the Enlightenment, everybody basically accepted the fundamentals of religion, whether it was Judaism or Christianity, Protestantism or Catholicism, that, God created the world, that we live forever, that we're judged on what we do in this world, that there's a very serious self-interest in avoiding sin and so forth. Now, with the Enlightenment, that pretty much got dissipated. You know that I've done a couple of shows on the Enlightenment in this previous series. However, even with the Enlightenment, man, by and large, could not wean himself from the idea of the existence of God. Because, frankly, all you have to do is either look in the mirror or look outside the window. I mean, you see the biggest miracle imaginable, which is creation itself and the abundance and beauty and variety of life. Where did it come from? You wouldn't see a watch lying on the ground and think that it didn't come from somewhere. How can you possibly see, a gnat? Gnats are pretty impressive, actually, because they're so tiny. And yet they can fly, they can find you, they can bite you, all that stuff. No-see-ums. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. Everywhere you look, you see these miracles of creation. So even when men turned away from a personal God in the Enlightenment, they actually couldn't get away from the existence of God anyway, which is why much of it went down the road of pantheism, where basically God is in everything. And that's kind of interesting, because it's sort of like they couldn't quite dismiss the idea of a causeless universe. So they still needed a cause, which was God. They just kind of needed him into, needed with a KN, mixed him in, stirred him in with creation, and basically said that all of creation is in fact part of God itself. Now, that's a ridiculous religion, but notice it's still not atheism. It took Darwin and evolution, essentially, to make atheism credible. So my thesis is that when the end of the world comes, when the second coming comes, it will have been precipitated by Darwinism, essentially, by the man's abandonment of God, turning his back on God, which is only made possible by the myth of evolution, the nonsense of evolution, being accepted as a fact. So that's basically the point of today's show. And you may remember this slide from the past if you've seen the movie The Matrix, is we have to deprogram ourselves, because basically we've been taught that evolution is a proven fact. And it's very, very hard to get rid of one of these fixed thoughts that has been planted in one's head since one's been, I don't know what, 4 years old or something. So, boy, why did I disappear there? Let me bring myself back. Okay. Now, so my argument is in today's show is not that theistic evolution is heretical from a Catholic perspective. It isn't. It's a more or less successful attempt to reconcile the Darwinian evolution with the existence of God. My point is that it's ridiculous to even try, because the only excuse for giving any credibility at all to Darwinian evolution is if you go on the premise, on the underlying assumption that there is no God. If you allow God into the equation, there is no reason at all to accept evolution. There's no scientific reason at all. There's no evidence. There's no proof. There are a lot of disproofs. There's a lot of missing evidence that should be there. And all of the evidence, so-called, is actually circular, and it disappears if you put God into the equation. So let me just move ahead. So what is theistic evolution? Theistic evolution is basically, it encompasses a wide range of beliefs, but generally, the principle of it is that God used the mechanism of evolution to produce all forms of life. In other words, theistic evolution accepts common descent, that we all descended from an original single, one-time, single-celled creature that somehow emerged in the primal soup of the earth 4 billion years ago. We all descended from that one organism, common descent. And the way that the vast complexity and variety of life came about was through mutations, stepwise mutations and natural selection. Now, in theistic evolution, by and large, those mutations are not random. They're directed by God, that somehow God decided to use this rather circuitous method of creation through evolution. And therefore, he kind of guided these mutations. When the mutation guided by God occurred, there was natural selection to allow that mutation to take over the population and wait for the next mutation, which would be an increase in complexity, which would eventually result in the complexity of life you see today. I notice that even with theistic evolution, the randomness of mutations is done away with, but the need for evolution to have taken place through small stepwise improvements, each step of which was in itself a improvement for the organism that enabled it to out-compete or out-survive its fellows and therefore take over the gene pool. That is still a necessary component of theistic evolution. Now, theistic evolution is allowable. It's not heretical, so to speak. It is, if I can say so, stupid and silly and nonsensical, but it's not heretical. We are free as good Catholics to believe the moon is made out of green cheese. I believe we are free to believe that. We're free to believe in theistic evolution if we so choose. I will give a lot of reasons in the course of the show why it would be very destructive to do so. But anyway, what is allowable as Catholics to not be heresy? The only requirements are that we have to believe that God created everything that exists, that God created all of contingent existence ab nihilo, out of nothing. It doesn't force us to say anything about the way he created things, the method he used. So maybe he used this process of guided evolution, so to speak. But everything has to have been created by God, and all of humanity has to have descended from one original human couple, because otherwise the dogma of original sin would not work. So those are basically the only fence posts, the only corral that we have to keep within to not be heretical as Catholics, is to accept those two principles. They clearly allow for God to have used evolution as his means of creation. Now, therefore, I'm repeating myself, that it's not contrary to dogma to believe that God used gradual stepwise mutations to create the diversity of life. It's not contrary to dogma to believe in common descent from an original one-celled organism 4 billion years ago. And it's not against dogma, it's not contrary to dogma to believe that man's bodies evolved from other animals. All that we have to believe is that the human soul, every human soul, comes directly from the hand of God. So what people who believe in theistic evolution believe in is that the bodies of animals evolved over time until the body of primates or ape-like animals and so forth evolved into the body of man. He still wasn't man, he was just a hairless ape, very hairless in this case. And then God decided to introduce, basically he created the first human soul, which is Adam. He placed this first human soul in this body of this evolved ape, and that became the first human being. Similarly with Eve, and then all of humanity since then have descended through natural generation from that original couple. So that's basically how they get around the it's called primogeniture, that all of mankind descended from one couple, how they reconcile that with evolution. So okay, so that's basically that's what I want to say. That's what, that's basically theistic evolution. Now, the one reason it is really silly and destructive to believe in theistic evolution is that the fundamental premise, a premise is basically an underlying assumption that on which everything else is built. And the fundamental premise under the science of evolution, that actually dares to call it science for that reason, is that there is no God and everything must be explainable without God. If you put God into the equation, it doesn't count. It is, it's discarded before it begins. It is thrown out from the get-go. So there can't be any God, there can't be any intelligent design. We must be able to explain everything without that. Now, if that is going to be the fundamental premise, then the basic rationale for believing in evolution is there's no alternative. Because basically there is no alternative without God. Now, evolution itself is no alternative because it doesn't make sense. It's got huge holes in the theory and fallacies, plus no evidence for it. But the bottom line always ends up being, well, there's a lot we don't know. There's a lot we can't explain. There's a lot that seems illogical, but there's no alternative, so it must be true. As Catholics, we're not in that position. As Catholics, we actually have to believe in God. So once you believe in God and your fundamental premise is that God exists, we are free to evaluate evolution as a science. We are free to evaluate the theory of evolution on its own merits. Notice that people who believe in evolution are not free to evaluate evolution on its own merits because they are forced to accept it, and they have to discard, either dishonestly or disingenuously, contradictions to it because it's the only game in town. For us, it's not the only game in town, so we are actually free to take a scientific attitude. They're not free to take a scientific attitude. Does this make sense? We're the scientific ones. They're not. They are the superstitious ones or the faith-based ones because they premise everything on an article of faith, which is that God doesn't exist. And then they are forced to accept non-science and anti-science as true because their premise, for which they have no evidence, doesn't allow an alternative. For us, alternatives exist. I wish this were a classroom so I could see your faces and find out if I'm making sense. I will occasionally look at the chat stream, so I know you have conversations among yourselves, but once in a while, throw me a little bone of how I'm doing, so to speak. Okay, now that was as Catholics, what we're free. Now, I'm repeating myself. But the underlying premise in evolution for it to be considered science is that everything has to be explained without God, and therefore we must ignore the huge holes in the theory. Now, in fact, the holes in the theory are bigger than the theory itself. I mean, there is no theory left after the holes, because what does evolution purport to explain? It purports to explain the origin of life and the increasing complexity of life, okay? How does it explain the origin of life? It doesn't even try. I talked about it in the last episode. It doesn't even have a hypothesis about the origin of life from non-life. In a moment, I'll show a little clip about that. The increasing complexity of life, it purports to explain by random mutation and natural selection. However, it fails to, because random mutation can't increase information or complexity, and we're a whole lot more complicated than that original miraculously produced single-celled organism. And the whole premise of natural selection is that every generation, every mutation is an advantage. So every little incremental mutation, which is going to be very small because it's like a single break in the chromosome or in the gene sequence, has to be advantageous. And there's this problem called irreducible complexity, where basically almost everything you see, all of our organs and so forth, couldn't have come about by incremental improvements, each of which was an improvement, incremental changes, each of which was an improvement, because, 1/10 of an eye doesn't do you any good, 1/10 of a liver doesn't do you any good. Blood without the ability to clot doesn't do you any good. Blood that can clot but can't unclot doesn't do you any good, and so forth. That's called irreducible complexity. So basically, it's rather comical because, let me find, I have a, okay, I have a slide here. Because what's evolution supposed to explain? The origin of life and the development of complexity. What is the theory unable to explain? The origin of life and the development of complexity. So it doesn't seem like a very attractive theory on its own, merits. Now, let me now I'm going to bring up a short clip of a scientist, named James Tour. I was very delighted to find out he's another Jewish convert, a fanatic follower of Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. He is not Catholic as of the moment. I did actually enter into an email exchange with him when I found out about him. I was so delighted. And he fights very hard against the myth of evolution. And he also fights very hard to make people know about Jesus and love Jesus. So I'll put up this little 3-minute clip. He's all over YouTube. If you just Google James Tour, you can have hours of him talking. He tends to say the same thing over and over again. His one shtick. He is a synthetic organic chemist. Now, what's that mean? Remember, the origin of life is dependent on there having been no life, and then there is this single-celled organism. There has to be a transition from no life to life. Now, what is the raw material of the original single-celled organism? It is organic chemicals, right? Everything in us is an organic chemical. I mean, any atom that is made up of carbon and hydrogen, I mean, all the stuff that makes life is organic chemistry, it's organic chemicals. So these organic chemicals had to be synthesized, that means put together, into that first living cell. So he points out that no one is better to talk about the impossibility of that transition than a synthetic organic chemist, because that's the business they're in, is making more and more complicated organic chemicals. Anyway, he does a better job, so let me just switch to him. So here goes.
I'm a synthetic organic chemist. Origin of life is purely synthetic organic chemistry. There's no way around it. I am perfectly situated to be commenting on this, to be critiquing the origin of life research. It is abiological. It is before biology takes over. This is purely synthetic organic chemistry. And making these compounds. It's very simple. 4 classes of compounds. You have to make them from what's available on a presumed prebiotic Earth. And so the chemistry is not hard for a synthetic organic chemist to follow, and any trained synthetic organic chemist can follow me on this. We do not know how to build even a simple bacterium. The simplest bacterium with its 256 protein coding genes, we have no idea how to build it. First of all, we don't know how to build the molecules, the 4 classes of molecules that are needed for it. We don't know how to, even if we had those 4 classes of molecules, assemble them even into the simplest of bacteriums. We don't know how to do that. Nobody has ever done it. And it's not because of lack of effort. It's not because of lack of will. First of all, they haven't been able to get the molecules to do this. And if they could make the molecules, even if we were to give them the molecules, they wouldn't have the information. There would be no inherent information in the DNA. But even if we gave them the DNA in the structure that they wanted, they wouldn't know how to put all the components together because of the sophistication within a cell. The interactomes, meaning that the interacting connectivity between the molecules, the van der Waals interactions, all of these have to be in the right place and in the right order for a cell to function. There's over 40,000 lipids have been identified in cell membranes. You want to take some simple ones? It's not just individual lipid membranes. You have to have the inside and the outside of the membrane have to be different. You have to have this huge array of proteins, that transmembrane proteins, and you have to have carbohydrates on the surface as identifiers. Even in the simplest bacterium, we have no idea how to put the structure together. It's not there. So not only do we not know how to make the basic components, we do not know how to build the structure even if we were given the basic components. So the Gedanken experiment is this: even if I gave you all the components, even if I gave you all the amino acids, all the protein structures from those amino acids that you wanted, all the lipids in the purity that you wanted, the DNA, the RNA, even in the sequence that you wanted, so I'm even giving you the code. And so now I say, and all the nucleic acids, can you now assemble a cell in your individual laboratories, not in a prebiotic cesspool, but in your nice laboratory? And the answer is a resounding no. And if anybody claims otherwise, they do not know this area.
Okay, well, I love his passion. What I brought up on this screen is actually a diagram of the simplest living bacterium. And you can see it's not all that simple. There are lots and lots and lots of parts that have to work together. And as Dr. Tour was pointing out, even if you had all the parts, it's not enough. You have to have all the parts put together right. This really is, it really is comical, actually. It's really, should be considered comical. That this premise that somehow, strands of amino acids or strands of complex proteins were, there were waves in this primordial soup and they just got jammed together into that. And I mentioned on, I think, the last show that there was a computer simulation run to basically simulate the replication of the RNA of the simplest bacterium, which had several hundred genes. And it took, I believe the number was 128 computers, 10 hours to simulate just the replication, not everything going on in that cell. In other words, not everything there, but simply the act of replicating. And this came out of nowhere, according to evolution, just literally came out of nowhere. Okay, so this is all just, this is just this stuff. This is just this stuff. This is just take the red pill. That's all this show is. But not only take the red pill from atheistic evolution, but please take the red pill from theistic evolution. Because I will talk about why theistic evolution also is extremely dangerous. It's very destructive to believe in theistic evolution. Look, if it's true, you believe in it. You believe in it because it's true. Okay, of course, no matter how destructive it is, if it were true, we should believe in it. But if it's not true anyway, why bend yourself into a pretzel to try to rationalize it as true when not only is it not true, but it's also destructive? Anyway, okay. Now, as I said, one of the huge holes in the theory of evolution, literally these holes are bigger than the substance. What you have here is a block of Swiss cheese with no cheese, okay? There's no cheese. Because if the hole is bigger than the cheese, you end up with no cheese, okay? So we have these holes in the theory of evolution which actually don't leave any cheese. One of those holes is you can't get to life from non-life. Another hole is you can't get an increase of complexity, right? That's the other thing evolution was supposed to show, was that or explain, was how we got increased complexity from this inexplicably produced original single-celled organism. So I showed this clip before. It's worth showing again. It's Richard Dawkins, probably the #1 evolutionary biologist of the late 20th century, trying to explain how information, mutations increase information. Increasing complexity equals increase of information. You're not going to get something more complex without information being added. So it's actually another way of asking how you get an increase of complexity. So let's see his answer as to how you get, how mutations or evidence of mutations increasing information.
Can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
Can you just stop while I...
Can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
Can you just stop while I...
I love the way he looks up at the ceiling and looks out the window for an answer. And of course, finally says, can you just stop there? Okay, so they're the two biggest, well, there are two very big holes in the Swiss cheese. No increase of information, no life from non-life. And the final hole in the Swiss cheese is that there's no way to have gradual steps, each of which is an improvement, create complex organs or even create blood or, you know, create the eye or even create giraffes, because I actually saw this in an evolution textbook, an explanation of the giraffe's neck just getting longer and longer and longer to reach the higher leaves, as though, you know, each generation, you know, could just, you know, get a little longer because they survive better. That's total nonsense, because in fact the giraffe has a very special pulmonary system, very special, not pulmonary, heart, blood pressure system, in order to get the blood up to the brain and yet not have the brain explode when the giraffe lowers its head from the high blood pressure. The long neck wouldn't have worked without the special heart-blood system, and of course the heart-blood system wouldn't have any purpose without the long neck and so forth. So anyway, I mean, if you just stop to think about it, again, just think of a liver or a lung. Think of the poor fish, right? The aquatic animal that was in water that crawled onto land and started breathing, okay? What did it have as lungs in between the fish lungs that breathed water and the air lungs that breathed air? Because there have to be little mutations at each step, okay? So again, 3 huge holes that are bigger than the cheese. It doesn't leave any cheese remaining. Okay. Now, the last thing, then I'm going to get off evolution and get onto its destructiveness. The last I talked about this before. Maybe I don't have to talk about this again. But there is a little bit of evidence, supposed evidence, that people who believe in evolution point to as proof of evolution. And I will bring up my favorite commentator again, Richard Dawkins, to explain it. I hope this is loud enough for you guys to hear.
And it's the molecular genetics which finally provide the detailed evidence, the absolute knockdown evidence that nobody could possibly go against, because the molecular evidence really shows with the detail of, just like a sort of human text, you can see the changing letters, the changing words of the DNA, which are in effect describing, as generations go by, describing the anatomical changes, which are all that Darwin himself was able to see.
Now, let me explain that a little bit. My apologies for those faithful viewers who have seen all the shows, so why are you repeating yourself? But anyway, basically the premise is this. There's a lot of commonality in the DNA in all of life. The proteins are in common, and stretches of DNA are in common. And Richard Dawkins is basically claiming that is absolute ironclad proof of common descent, because it's too much to be a coincidence that we share strings of DNA, for instance, with a pig. So we must have had a common ancestor which had those strings of DNA, and it branched off on one side to the line that ended up as a pig, and it branched off on the other side to the branch that ended up in being us. So basically the commonality in the DNA is this ironclad molecular biology evidence of evolution. The problem with that is it's an entirely circular argument, because it's only evidence of evolution if there's been no intelligent design, if it happened by chance. If in fact a designer designed both the pig and the human being, then the fact that that designer used the same DNA to produce common elements of the two animals, the two creatures, human beings and pigs, also fish and bats and birds and insects, and probably even bacteria share commonalities in DNA. Because of course it works. I mean, in other words, God, this whole system for life that God came up with is absolutely astounding. And why wouldn't he use aspects of the same design? The metaphor that I used on last show, which I think is true, is, we have 4-cycle engines all around us, right? I mean, the guy who came up with a 4-cycle engine, let's say it was to make a locomotive way back when. Well, it ended up in my lawnmower, it ended up in my car, it ended up in my weed whacker, and so forth, And this isn't because the weed whacker came from the locomotive or the car came from the locomotive. It's that it was a good design. Why wouldn't we reuse it? It would be really stupid to throw it away and start over from scratch. So God reused his design, and whoops, there goes the entire proof, the entire argument of common descent from molecular biology. Just flushed down the toilet, back into the primordial soup from whence it came. So that's basically it. That's why, why there's no, so if any rationale for evolution is completely contingent on God not existing, why would anyone who believes in God give any credence to the theory of evolution? And there's only one reason, and we all know what that reason is. And the reason is they took the blue pill. They were given the blue pill in junior high school or whatever. And they're not taking the red pill. I would love to hear, I guess it'll have to be in the, in the comments or something. But I would love to hear from let me bring me back up. Okay. I'd love to hear from from a Catholic who, a believing Catholic who believes in theistic evolution, why they believe in theistic evolution. My suspicion is they would think they have to because of the evidence for evolution without having looked closely at what is claimed to be evidence for evolution. Okay. I don't want to redo the last two shows. So, okay, on and on and on. So, why, okay, why buy into theistic evolution? If one accepts evolution as proven, or if one believes that evolution has been proven, then you have to accept evolution. And if you believe in God, you want to leave room for God. So this theistic evolution is a way of, if evolution were true, leaving room for God. However, all proof for evolution is based on the premise of no God. So we're not rejecting evolution on the basis of faith. We're rejecting evolution on the basis of science. They are rejecting science on the basis of faith, okay? We are rejecting evolution on the basis of science. It's exactly backwards. I'll just repeat that, because it's confusing even me. We're not rejecting evolution on the basis of faith. This isn't a Galileo situation with heliocentrism. We're not rejecting evolution on the basis of faith. We're rejecting evolution on the basis of science. They are rejecting science on the basis of faith, which is that the premise has to be no God. Let us force evolutionists to admit their postulate that God does not exist. Let's force them to admit that everything that they are saying is dependent on their underlying premise that God does not exist, and that everything which passes for proof evaporates if God exists. Now, I know I'm skipping the argument about natural selection within a species versus new species creation. My argument still holds, but things get complicated if you want to go down every little side path and answer every possible quibble, because the quibbles are by and large not even in good faith. So anyway, I'll leave that for some opportunity to do so. But basically, it would be nice if people who believed in evolution were forced to admit that their fundamental postulate, that the one thing that makes their argument hang together is the postulate that God does not exist. Okay, now, why is it a bad idea to accept theistic evolution if it's unnecessary, so to speak? Well, so the title of the slide, I guess, is If No Evidence for Evolution, Why Bother? Well, one reason not to bother with theistic evolution. Now I'm going to get theological, okay, because we've already rejected evolution on the basis of science. So now we can talk about theistic evolution basically on the basis of theology, right? Because we're already in the domain of believing in God. I'm not mixing, in other words, I'm not rejecting evolution on the basis of theology, on the basis of faith. I am, saying, okay, we've done that. Now let's look at what theistic evolution says about God, okay? Is it consistent with how we think of God to think that he creates things only to destroy them? Okay, because that's the story of the stepwise increase in complexity, right? All of these theoretical animals were created, were functioning, were marvels of design, but they were only created in order to be destroyed. Creation takes place through destruction. Improvement takes place through extinction. It is good for the weak to die out because that's the way you improve the general population. The structure of creation is ruthless competition and survival of the fittest. And basically, eugenics is God's way. The extermination of the weak is God's way. I'm not saying this is a reason to reject evolution. I'm saying it's a reason to reject theistic evolution if you're a Catholic who believes in God. Then you are kind of free to say, hey, wait a minute, how does this jibe with what we know about God and how we think about God? So let's just be honest about the picture of how God is working if he's working through theistic evolution versus how God is working if he's working through Genesis and the individual creation of every species as its species. If he is working through Genesis, then everything that exists is a direct expression of the beauty and cleverness of God. Direct, okay? The beauty of the butterfly, The beauty of the flower in blossom, in bloom, the beauty of the trees in blossom, those were all intended by God and came from his imagination to delight us, essentially. It's a very different view of the world. Let me throw in another thing, which seems to me very telling. I don't know if it'll make any sense to you, which is, we can't survive without eating, right? Here, I'll take a drink of iced coffee. Every morsel of food that passes our lips, we should be grateful for, because it's what keeps us alive. Have you eaten anything recently that was never alive? Is there any inanimate matter that is food? I don't think so. I think even, McDonald's hamburgers started out being alive. Every bite of food we eat required the miracle of life. Not only did we require the miracle of life to be alive, but every bite of food that we eat required the miracle of life. Every bite of food that we eat, in that sense, came directly from the hand of God, because he brought it into life, and then it died and became asparagus, cooked asparagus or whatever. But it had to be alive for it to be food. I think giving God credit for that is changes our sense of gratitude towards God. Giving God credit for all of the beauty and variety in creation changes our sense of gratitude and appreciation of God. If God worked through theistic evolution, that would be greatly diminished or eliminated. Now, I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm just asking you to kind of think about it, and if it makes sense to you, then believe it. So we have this horrible picture of the world through evolution. If it were true, it would just be unfortunate. But if God exists, then why hold on to that horrible picture of the world? It's not only a horrible picture of the world, and it's not only dissing God. I do think it disses God, because it doesn't make God the artist who created everything. It made God something less than that, because he worked through, mutation and creative destruction and eugenics and all of that stuff. So, but, it's also really bad with its anthropology, what it does to the nature of man, okay? So here are some of the theological issues introduced by theistic evolution. What does it do to our sense of man, okay? Are we the image and likeness of God, or are we a rational animal? Are we just kind of the height of the animal kingdom infused with this human soul? Of course, we have to be infused with the human soul if we're going to be a faithful Catholic. We have to know that the human soul comes directly from the hand of God. But nevertheless, we got to where we are by being an evolving animal before we got that soul. To me, it's like, we are an animal, and a fairy godmother passed her magic wand over us and said, poof, now you're a man. It's not quite the same thing as having been created from the get-go in the image and likeness of God. Another huge problem is what it does to human sexuality. Because, in fact, is our sexual nature then simply a remnant of our animal nature? I'm sure you've heard this coming out of the wazoo, that somehow human sexuality is a vestige of our animal nature. So let's compare that to the alternative of God as genuinely creating. Because in truth, our sexual nature and our ability to reproduce this through the spousal union isn't an animal thing that is kind of left over in us. It's actually a descent of the divine, okay? This is not for this talk, and my wife does a much better job of this because it's her field as a philosopher. But in fact, God is love. God is the most holy Trinity, because you need multiple persons in order to have love. So you have the two persons, the Father and the Son, and you have the Holy Spirit, which in some sense is the third person created by the love between the Father and the Son. At least that's the general Western Church view of things. And the spousal union, the complementarity of man and woman, is actually a descent of the nature of God into humanity, so to speak. And the ability to procreate through the love between the spouses is a descent into humanity of God's creative power. And in fact, it enables man to co-create with God at the very pinnacle of creation. Why did God create the universe? The entire universe, all of contingent existence. Why did God create it? For one reason, to create immortal human souls to be with him in heaven for all eternity. Okay? It's the creation of immortal human souls, which is God's purpose in creation. Guess what? He can't do that without us. He can't do that without us in the spousal relationship, right? And in the spousal union. So in fact, our sexuality is our ability to co-create with God, immortal human souls, the purpose of creation. So do you see the picture I'm trying to paint is our sexual nature is a descent of the divine into the human. It's not an ascent of the animal into the human. Okay. I think there's a huge problem with buying into evolution, even as theistic evolution. Okay, I hope that made sense because I'm tremendously excited about that. But as I said, my wife does a much better job of that. Her name is Maria Federica, FedorYka. You can find some of her talks up on YouTube also. But her field, she's the chair of philosophy at Ave Maria University. I'm very proud of her, obviously. And her field is, I know it sounds like a 50s rock song, but it's the philosophy of love, basically. It's the philosophy of love. But serious Catholic philosophy. But the focal point, it's personalism. It's realist phenomenological personalism. But the focal point is actually love, which is not a silly focal point for Catholic philosophy, since God is love. Enough of an advertisement for her. So anyway, okay, where was I? So what's it do to our sense of man? Now, this is the sense of man, of course, that we have from evolution. I'm just showing these because it's fun. This is from Haeckel, the fraudster who came up with ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny from the previous show. So this is where man came from. You see the cells, bacterium, tadpoles, snakes, fish, amphibian, kangaroo, monkey, blah, 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 into that man walking upright carrying a tool. I won't comment. I think that he may have been guilty of some 19th century racism there. If there are any statues of Haeckel, please tear them down. Seriously, tear them down, not only for his racism, but for his what he did to the sense of dignity of man. And of course, if you've taken high school biology, you know that this is not a theory, this is fact. And we have here, the documented evolution's long path from the missing link to modern man. And there you have the drawings, you have the time that they appeared, you have the distinctive skull patterns and so forth that show that, nice even progression over 40 million years to get from our common pre-human ancestor to us. And this is, of course, all science. But the point of this isn't just to diss evolution. It's to show how pseudoscientific it is. In other words, how, and it's to show what it does to our sense of ourselves, basically. I mean, really, what is the 10-year-old kid who sees this in their textbook, or the 12-year-old kid who sees this in their textbook, going to think about his immortal dignity, about sexual purity, and so forth, if he's thinking in terms of pictures like this? Okay, so let me see if I have anything else fun here. Now, so what are some of the fruits of Darwinism? Phew, I am going to get through this show in time. I'm glad. I was afraid I was packing too much in. Can any of you guys type her name, please? I will do that, I suppose, afterwards. I'll maybe even put a link in the comments if I remember. Okay. Okay, now, what are some of the fruits of believing in Darwinian evolution, or even any form of evolution, theistic evolution? If it's true, then we don't have to worry about the fruits. If it's true, we have to believe it. I'm not a creationist. I'm not saying we dismiss it because I believe something else. However, if God exists, and there is no reason whatsoever to accept it if God exists, because the hole in the Swiss cheese is bigger than the Swiss cheese, then we're free to consider its effects on belief in God, sexual morality, and what I'm calling applied Darwinism, which is basically social programs, political movements, which were totally dependent on Darwinism in order to emerge and be accepted and actually paint the history of the last 120 years. Okay? And I will spend the rest of the show proving these points, so to speak. Marx, Lenin, and Stalin, and Trotsky were all devoted Darwinists. Marx particularly, and of course he was the origin of Marxism/communism. And Stalin was responsible for 20 to 60 million dead. Hitler was a devoted Darwinian evolutionist. I will support that, but he basically heavily relied on Darwinian evolution as a moral justification for what he was doing. And he was responsible for at least 11 million non-combatants dead. That doesn't even include the combatants, like all the Russian soldiers and so forth, Polish soldiers who were killed. And Mao Zedong, and the Red Chinese, and Mao being responsible for between 25 and 45 million dead. So there you have, pushing 100 million dead. You could say that was Darwinism in action. I don't know. Wasn't Darwinism in action. Well, in another sense, it was Darwinism in action. It was deaths due to philosophies that were dependent on Darwinism. Political movements that were dependent on Darwinism. Okay, so yeah, I'm just thinking of whether there's any reason. I'll just move on. If I go in circles, I'll never make forward progress. I keep thinking of things. Oh, I wish I mentioned that 3 slides ago, but there's no percentage in that. So here are some quotes from Karl Marx. Actually, before I get into them as quotes, I should have kept my picture up, I guess. Okay, where's my picture? Sorry about that. Okay, Marx was in England at the time, and he enthusiastically read Darwin's book as soon as it came out. He reread it within a year. He participated in a study group led by Huxley, Thomas Huxley, on Darwin's theory of evolution. He attended a series of lectures, by Thomas Huxley on Darwin's ideas. And for months, he spoke of nothing else other than Darwin's theory of evolution and its enormous scientific significance. Okay, when Darwin, in that period, I'll just move to the slide here. So here's some extracts from a couple of letters that Karl Marx wrote. One of the letters was to Friedrich Engels, his collaborator on Das Kapital. And the other letter was to someone named Lassalle. I don't know who he was. Okay, so here are some quotes from Karl Marx's letters about Darwin. That Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, is the basis in natural history for our view. That, of course, is Marxism. Not only is it a death blow to teleology in the natural sciences, but their rational meaning is empirically explained. Teleology in the natural sciences meaning that there's a purpose to things, basically. That things have a purpose in their progression. Teleology means the study of the end. So anyway, not only is it a death blow to teleology in the natural sciences, but their rational meaning is empirically explained. The rational meaning, of course, being their extermination for the improvement later on. Of all those eminent researchers, is a quote, Of all those eminent researchers of the 19th century who have left us such a rich heritage of knowledge, we are especially grateful to Charles Darwin for opening our way to an evolutionary dialectical understanding of nature. Okay? Again, Marxism was essentially the application, what Darwin applied to nature, Marx applied to human society. As a matter of fact, the next quote says that explicitly. Darwin's book is very important and serves me as a natural, scientific basis for the class struggle in history. Okay, so there you have it. Can't be much clearer than that. And so let me move on. Let me stay with, I'm getting out of chronological sequence. Let me stay with communism for a while, and then I will move to, I'll move to Nazism. So, just there's a little picture of Marx up there in the corner of Karl Marx, but just because I like pictures, there is a full-size picture of Karl Marx. Karl Marx, of course, was Jewish by heritage, although I believe that his parents were already Christian. Lutheran, I believe. I could have that wrong. Anyway, I could have almost everything wrong except my preaching, I hope. Anyway, here is obviously a communist Chinese poster showing the progression. If I'm not mistaken, it is Darwin to Marx to Lenin to Stalin to Mao Zedong. So there you have evolution. There you have the evolution of applied Darwinism, so to speak, done in a nice. Of course, what this means, since they've lined them up in a row, we know that. How can I put this? That Marx was the offspring of Darwin, that Lenin was the offspring of Marx, that Stalin was the offspring of Lenin, and that Mao was the offspring of Stalin. Because whenever you line things up in a neat row like that, it means that that's the order of descent. Because I learned something from high school evolution, right? Because that's all evolution does, is it lines things up in a row of drawings and says that the fact that they make a nice row of drawings means that that's how things happen. So that's okay. Let me get this back to me. So that is that evolution of communism, so to speak. And so okay, that was Marx, and okay, so Lenin was the next icon in that progression. So let me turn to Lenin here. Now, Lenin only had one piece of art in his office, and it was that statue you see to the left. It's a statue of an ape sitting on a stack of books. That stack of books includes The Origin of Species, and you can't see it on the slide, but Darwin is written in large letters on the second book from the top. And he's contemplating a human skull. He's sitting there over the word Darwin. And it was in Lenin's office, you know, whenever he was issuing the order for the extermination of millions or whatever. And it was a symbol that man is only an animal, that his life is worth no more than an animal, that the world is a jungle, and the purpose is to bring a higher state of evolution out of the corpses of the current state of man, essentially, right? Which is what, you know, which is the rationale for communism, that to bring about the utopian society, we're going to have to, supposedly, as Stalin said, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. We're going to have to basically exterminate a lot of people now in order to create the more glorious future, and individual lives are irrelevant. So I'm not speculating by saying that Lenin was a devoted Darwinist, if that was the sculpture in his office. Now, Stalin was a seminarian. He was studying for the priesthood, Orthodox priesthood, of course. And this is a direct quote from the memoirs of another seminarian who was a friend of Stalin in seminary. Okay, I'll read it. In order to disabuse the minds of our seminary students of the myth that the world was created in 6 days, we had to familiarize ourselves with Darwin's teaching, with Darwin's Descent of Man. Comrade Stalin brought these books to our notice. Many of us began to acquire a materialistic outlook and to ignore theological subjects. Our reading not only helped our young people to escape from the bigoted and narrow-minded spirit of the seminary, but also prepared their minds for the reception of Marxist ideas. Every book we read helped to confirm us in the truth of Marxism. So actually, what you see here is kind of interesting, because what you see here is, I'm going to go back to this slide. What you see here is actually that Marxism and Darwinism was the blue pill. It was the blue pill. Before the Enlightenment, before Darwinism, people basically lived in the world of the red pill. They lived in reality. They had to take a blue pill to live in the matrix. So that's what you saw in that quote of the seminarian. Now, where was I? That was Stalin. And so this is another quote from Stalin. I have a little picture of him in the top corner there. In his article or booklet, Anarchism or Socialism, direct quote, evolution prepares for revolution and creates the ground for it. Revolution consummates the process of evolution and facilitates its further activity. Okay? Can't get more direct than that. You know, the Russian Revolution was evolution in action. It was applied Darwinism, period. Trotsky, who was kind of the theorist to some extent, he was unfortunately Jewish, unfortunately as a Jew. But he was kind of like a big preacher and theorist for the Russian Revolution. He got killed pretty soon after the Bolsheviks took over. But anyway, this is a direct quote from him. Darwin stood for me like a mighty doorkeeper at the entrance to the temple of the universe. Very interesting quote. By the way, I like that picture of Trotsky. He looks like a very intelligent Jew, actually, if you ask me. But anyway, Darwin stood for me like a doorkeeper, mighty doorkeeper, at the entrance to the temple of the universe. You see, it's a religion. It's a religion. It is actually the alternative to faith. The alternative to faith in God is faith in evolution. Can't get around it. That's why I think that it is the theory of evolution that's going to bring about the end of the world, so to speak. It is really the only faith alternative to belief in God. Remember this slide? Anyway, that's my premise for the show, or that's my, not premise, but that's my, I don't know, theme of the show. So let me get back to where I was. And so I was in Trotsky. Okay, now we come to Mao. Mao, of course, was less anchored in the Western tradition, but he also acknowledged depends on Darwinism. This is a quote from him in 1957. Correct and good things have often at first been looked upon not as fragrant flowers, but as poisonous weeds. We're talking about genocide there, as a correct and good thing, by the way. Copernicus's theory of the solar system and Darwin's theory of evolution were once dismissed as erroneous and had to win out over bitter opposition. So he is, by implication, justifying the genocide in China, whatever it was, 20 million, 30 million, 45 million, as applied Darwinism. Okay. So, let's see if I have, oh yeah, just you don't really need a picture of Mao, but if you want a picture of Mao, there's a picture of Mao as a idealistic young man, and there's a picture of Mao as a less young man. Now, let me get to one of my favorite topics. Boy, that's damning, isn't it? My favorite topics are apparently very dark. But anyway, which is Nazism? If you haven't read my book, Salvation is from the Jews, it's a central theme of it. And by the way, as long as I'm advertising, I meant to advertise at the beginning of the show. I think I have two double rooms left on my November pilgrimage to the Holy Land. I guarantee it's a unique pilgrimage. Music provided by Harpa Dei, who provided the music in the opening slide, and narrative provided by me with a Jewish roots flavor. So anyway, and also, by the way, with a tremendous orientation towards prayer. So I know it's kind of expensive. It's cheap for a pilgrimage to Israel from the United States, actually. It's much less than, it's like $1,500 less than Steve Ray's, more than $1,500 less than Steve Ray's, actually. He's a friend of mine. I'm not dissing him, but just it is relatively cheap. But that's a lot of money in absolute terms, and I respect that. So I'm not asking you to come, but if you're interested in coming, I think there are two doubles left. End of advertisement. So Nazism, my semi-favorite topic. Okay, now it's really interesting. That's why it's like 100+ pages in Salvation is from the Jews. But Nazism actually was the fruit of two streams, both of which were actually dependent on Darwinism. But there was a spiritual stream which came from Theosophy, and a social stream. And let me start with the spiritual stream because it started earliest. Theosophy was basically an early form of the New Age. It supposedly came from these ascended Hindu masters who were speaking through the kind of guru who introduced Theosophy. Her name was Madame Blavatsky. Now, Madame Blavatsky was born in Russia, but she left Russia. She spent a lot of time in India where she got into all this Hinduism stuff. She ended up in Europe. She was a very wicked woman. And here's just a picture of her. I think she seems kind of demonic. And that's the seal of the Theosophical Society on the side. And you can see in the top circle in that seal is a swastika. Hitler's spiritual origins of Nazism flowed directly from Theosophy through Ariosophy, which was a Germanic adaptation of Theosophy. For full details, see my book. And the swastika, basically, the reason I'm showing that seal is because the swastika is an inheritance that Nazism still had owed to Theosophy and Madame Blavatsky. But now getting back to Madame Blavatsky, this is what she wrote in her main book, Theosophy. You'll see why I'm doing this, because this is where the extermination of the Jews came from. The human races are born one from the other, grow, develop, become old, and die. Occult philosophy teaches us that even now, under our very eyes, the new race and races are preparing to be formed. It is the present men who will die out in their turn to sow the seeds for a forthcoming, grander, and far more glorious race than any of those we know of at present. This, by the way, was Hitler's Superman race. In Hitler's eyes, is what she was talking about. Humanity is the child of cyclic destiny, each year after the other dropping one sub-race, but only to beget another higher race on the ascending cycle, while a series of other less favored groups, the failures of nature, will vanish from the human family without ever leaving a trace behind. So what we basically had was this view from Theosophy that human races replaced each other. I think we were in the 6th human race or something, according to Blavatsky. And they moved upwards and upwards and upwards. They were on their way to becoming the Superman race. The Aryan Superman that Hitler was after, who would have all these wonderful powers. And they were held back by inferior races because there was still a mix of races. And the intermingling of the blood between the inferior races and the superior elements of the current race was preventing the evolution of the race. The most degenerate race, and she goes into great gory detail on this, were the Jews. They were almost beasts. They were almost animals. And their bloodlines were the most base and retarded, the most depraved and base of the bloodlines. Basically, their subrace was the most depraved and brutish of the subraces on Earth at the time. And so exterminating their pollution of the blood would facilitate the emergence of the super race. Hitler got this straight from Blavatsky. So let's see what the next slide has to show us. So that's basically where his Superman race progression theory came from. And much of the effort in the Third Reich was to use selective breeding and euthanasia to improve the gene pool of the human race and develop this Superman. I will get to a fun aspect of this in a few moments. So let me just move on, see what I have here for us. Okay, so Hitler. I know you believe me by now. I mean, we all know Hitler's philosophy. What years did Blavatsky live? Blavatsky, she lived really long, like 97 years. She lived from, I would say, maybe 1850 to 1940 something like that. Okay, Hitler. Quotes from Hitler. Whoever ignores or despises the laws of race places an obstacle in the victorious path of the superior race, and by so doing, he interferes with a prerequisite condition for all human progress. Anyone see hints of Darwinism here? The church must get used to the doctrine of blood and race. Just as the Catholic Church could not change the fact that the earth goes around the sun, so the church could not do away with the irrefutable facts which are given in blood and race. Whether we consider questions of general justice or cultural decline or political degeneration, everywhere and always, it is fundamentally the disregard of the racial needs of one's own people or failure to see a foreign racial menace. So, I don't really have to go through this. We all know that the entire Third Reich and extermination of the Jews and extermination of the Gypsies and other inferior peoples, and by the way, the handicapped, including the mentally handicapped and those in mental institutions and so forth, was an attempt to, it was eugenics. It was an attempt to improve the human race, which justified it all because we're talking about applied Darwinism. So let's see what else I have here. This is from Mein Kampf. It's kind of obvious. Any crossing of two beings at not exactly the same level produces a medium between the level of the two parents. The offspring will not stand as high as the higher one. It will succumb later in the struggle against a higher level, and therefore such mating is contrary to the will of nature for a higher breeding of all life. The stronger must dominate and not blend with the weaker, thus sacrificing his own greatness, for this law did not prevail. Any conceivable higher evolution of organic living beings would be unthinkable. Well, fortunately for human evolution, the Nazis had a plan. Well, before I get there, let me just go to the Nazi educational program, which was as draconian as our own in having to teach Darwinian evolution. Here's an extract from the 1938 Ministry of Education. Hitler became chancellor in 1933. So this was 5 years into Hitler's chancellorship. All schools must teach the evolution of human races through selection and elimination. Quote, the student must accept as something self-evident this most essential natural law of elimination of the unfit, together with evolution. They must teach the emergence of the primitive human races in connection with the evolution of animals. Mea culpa, I think that means the Jews, as primitive human races. They must teach Darwinism and its worldview and political implications. You see, these are political implications of Darwinism. Remember, the point of the show is why bother with theistic evolution? Why stay away from theistic evolution? Why the church should not embrace theistic evolution? Because even theistic evolution crosses into this gray area of these political implications of Darwinism. Anyway, going on. And they must teach contemporary human races in view of evolutionary history. In other words, you're getting to sort of that theosophy thing that we're continuing the course of evolution with our current races, and therefore we should exterminate the inferior ones and breed the superior ones. They had a plan for breeding the superior ones. It was called the Lebensborn program. Let me find, I'm getting out of, okay. I don't have it. Anyway, this is the Lebensborn program. I forgot what Lebensborn means. That's why I'm embarrassed and looking frantically. Anyway, it was the Lebensborn program. And the program basically involved selecting the most genetically favored, the most super race young women and breeding them with the most super race men. The most super race men were, of course, the SS. And the most super race young women were blue-eyed blondes. I'm sorry. So they had these Lebensborn centers where basically the SS would select the candidates for these young women. They were breeding farms, and the young women would live in these breeding farms. The SS men would come and visit and select one of these young women and mate with her, have relations with her, and she would bear a child to be a child of the super race. I am not making this up. There were tens of thousands of these. I don't have the number in front of me, young women and offspring. So here we have a slide of a SS officer choosing who is to be graced with the privilege of being the mother of his super child. Where do we have here? Let me keep going. Here we have a parade of the young women who were selected for the Lebensborn program. Here we have the front lawn of one of these Lebensborn institutes. Note the number of baby carriages, because they had a lot of babies. They were breeding farms. So all the baby carriages lined up, all the baby carriages lined up, all the young women lined up, all the baby carriages lined up. And and now, what on earth is this slide doing here? That is the Swedish rock group ABBA. I don't know if you know of them, but I think they sold more records than any group other than the Beatles, whatever that makes it. I don't know what the number is. A super successful rock group. And one of them was a child of the Lebensborn program. She actually wasn't the blonde. She was that kind of darker red-haired. What's her name? Her name is... I don't have it in front of me. Frida something. Anyway, so she was actually a child of the Lebensborn program. These people really exist. In fact, they had a program, or they had a system in the Lebensborn program. If a child was born and their hair wasn't light enough colored, I think that Frida's hair wasn't light enough colored, they had this program of trying to bleach it with artificial light, hoping that they would really become lighter haired, because supermen are supposed to be blonde. Anyway, where are those offspring? They're all over. Because they liked that type of women for the Lebensborn program, They actually recruited the young women. They were volunteers. Well, actually, they weren't entirely volunteers. They recruited the young women from occupied territories. They really liked Norway and Sweden as recruitment sources. And Frida's mother actually was Swedish. That's how she ended up in Sweden. They recruited them from France and so forth too. But there was this selection process to get the blue-eyed blondes to recruit. And let me tell you I don't want to say the dark underbelly of this, because it's all a dark underbelly. It's really horrible. The whole thing is really horrible. But what they would do is they would basically kidnap young girls, apparently like 12, 13, 14-year-old girls, and tell them that their parents were killed, in the war. And then they would care for them, so to speak, or raise them in the Lebensborn Institutes to be breeders. And here you have a line of them who were presumably these kidnapped children before they were actually being used for breeding babies. So you can see that they were selecting, the Aryan types. But it's really, really sad, because you see that they're still children. And these were children. I'm actually going to take that off because it's kind of intrinsically vulgar. But they were children. This was child abuse. These were kidnapped children, separated from their parents, told their parents were dead, and essentially put into sexual slavery and breeding slavery. So anyway, can't get much uglier than that. But let's put on the glasses of Darwinism, okay? All of this, in the eyes of Darwinism, is progress. All of this in the eyes of Darwinism is just helping nature proceed along its teleological path towards improvement. Okay? That's the point of the show. This is what you get, in a sense, philosophically and politically and socially with Darwinism. It leads you down these roads, which is why I really want to nail the coffin shut on the idea of theistic evolution, because you're not free from these mental implications. If you think in terms of theistic evolution, you're still thinking that creation comes through destruction, and that the elimination of the less fit is how you get the more fit. They're both there in theistic evolution, right? Because you're going through these stepwise, gradual changes. Theistic evolution always accepts, to my knowledge, common descent, which means the progression of the higher from the lower and the extermination or disappearance of the lower. So it's all creative destruction. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to mention in this show is what Darwinian evolution and perhaps theistic evolution does to our concept of man. I mentioned this earlier. I can't find the slide to pull up. But I will make the argument that obviously there's a qualitative difference between man and animals. Even in Catholic theistic evolution, there's a qualitative difference because we have an immortal soul. However, in Catholics, in theistic evolution held by Catholics, I'll say, the only qualitative difference between us and animals might be the infusion of the human soul. Everything else is our animal nature that has come up through evolution to the point where it qualified for the infusion of the human soul. That's why I think it's like this fairy godmother's magic wand waved over us. So the distinction between animal and man becomes more one of degree than of one of kind. I know people could yell at me and say, no, it's a difference of kind because we have a soul. Maybe not. Maybe we're a rational animal imbued with a immortal soul. God knows. But there's no way you're going to grow up with that picture of the amoeba in the primordial soup slime cesspool, as James Tour called it, up through frogs and monkeys and apes to pre-man, and then zap, we get our soul and we're man, without being confused about the qualitative distinction between animals and men. Now, we have a great example of what happens if you confuse the qualitative, the absolute discontinuous abyss between animals and man. If you disregard it, you get things like PETA, which is the something for the ethical treatment of animals, people for the ethical treatment of animals. So I have some PETA slides here. We all know the evils of racism. Well, of course, PETA adds the evils of racism, the evils of speciesism. Okay, you see here that in the top, if you can read it, students opposing speciesism, because to think that human beings are somehow qualitatively different and have rights that animals don't have is speciesism. So they've hijacked racism and developed speciesism. The time for animal liberation is now. Help lead the revolt against human supremacy. Help end speciesism. Okay? I know it's not quite fair to say this is a logical consequence of Darwinism. But you can see the link. You can see the link. I mean, I'm an impressionistic painter. Okay? I mean, maybe I'm not Jackson Pollock, purely impressionistic. You have no idea of what's on the canvas is supposed to represent. Maybe I'm more like Paul Klee or something. I don't know my artists. Van Gogh, where at least you know what's being painted. But I'm not drawing with precise, ink or pencil lines. I am trying to, my argument tries to reflect almost like how we think subconsciously, how a society evaluates things. It's not rigid logic. It's in pictures, it's in metaphors, it's in kind of, jumping from A to B in a somewhat impressionistic way. So that's what I'm doing here. So don't yell at me too much for this impressionism. So anyway, so these are slides from PETA. Here, that's one. Help students opposing speciesism. Here's another. The tagline here is, imagine this is yours. And it's a hunter hunting a tiger. But of course, the tiger is a cute little 6-year-old because there's no moral distinction between animals and man. I know I'm beating a dead horse, so to speak. Not a dead baby, I hope. But anyway. In showing these slides, but I think they're cute. And since I talked about the Holocaust, here is a very specific one. To animals, all people are Nazis. And on the left, you have a famous photograph of Auschwitz at its liberation. The prisoners who were not yet dead in the bunks. And on the right, you have chickens in their hens. And of course, there's a moral equivalence between animals and men. So I think that's probably, here's the final one. And this is again, the total equivalence between animals and men. So when you grill that piece of steak on your outdoor grill, imagine that it's a human body because there is no moral difference. So that is that. And now I am simply going to, this is a conclusion. I'm actually getting to the conclusion. I actually am going to end. You'll be relieved. Anyway, since the show tries to be about theistic evolution, if God chose to create through evolution, creation takes place through destruction. It's good that the weak die because then the race or the species gets stronger. Improvement comes about through extinction of the weaker or inferior. Survival of the fittest is the sine qua non of advancement. Ruthless competition is the fabric of creation, of development. Man still has remnants of his animal nature because we are infused into an evolved animal. And essentially, eugenics is God's way, right? The extermination of the weak, the extermination of the inferior is God's way. And that seems to me to be impressionistically an unavoidable implication of theistic evolution. Theistic evolution, this is by way of summary, undermines the sense of a fundamental difference between man and animal. Man is just a rational animal with a immortal soul kind of, injected into him, rather than being the image and likeness of God in every cell of our being, in some sense. I mean, in every aspect of our. I can't do this because I will get in too much trouble. But I'll just leave it there. That it undermines the sense, the fundamental difference between man and animal. We end up feeling more like a rational animal than the image and likeness of God. It's as though we're an animal with a magic wand passed over it. We still have an animal nature. Our sexuality is still a vestige from our animal nature, rather than being a descent of our divine nature, so to speak. Of course, the implications of that are monogamy is unnatural. Sex is simply an animal function. I won't go into graphic details and so forth, as opposed to the opposite, which is that sexuality is a descent from the union of persons in God into the human domain. It's part of us being it's part of us being made in the image and likeness of God. It is the place where we are most godlike in our ability to cooperate with God in the fundamental purpose of creation itself, which is the creation of immortal human beings. And it's only fallen human nature, the concupiscence that comes from the fall of Adam and Eve, that leads to the use of sexuality for its own sake rather than for its kind of divine sake. So guess what? I've actually come to the end of the show. I was worried that I wouldn't be able to end today on time because I was trying to cover so much. But it is the feast of the most precious blood, and I get to go to not only a Tridentine Mass, but a beautifully sung Gregorian chant Tridentine Mass. So I have to end the show. So, okay, I'm just glancing at the chat stream. It seems like at least some of you, the ones of you who are still with me, liked it. It's not just evolution that is a bad way of thinking. It's not just atheistic evolution that's a bad way of thinking. The point of this show was theistic evolution is a bad way of thinking also. And since there's no grounds for accepting any of the nonsense of evolution, if you have a premise of God existing, then let's throw the bathwater away with the baby, so to speak. Let's throw the whole thing out wholesale. We are so much better than theistic evolution. God is so much better than theistic evolution. Let us worship God. Let's worship God, in our divine nature. Let's worship God in the beauty of creation. Let's worship God with every morsel of food which had to once be alive to even qualify as food that we take in for our own nourishment. Let's not look at a cockroach or a butterfly, or a dog or a tree without seeing the cleverness of God. When we look at the cockroach, we're allowed to think of the fallen state of nature, because my personal theory is that all of the unpleasant things in nature, it's not just my theory, it's actually in Genesis to some extent too, but the ugly things in nature, the mosquitoes and the spiders and the cockroaches, and the snakes, and the poor, all that stuff is actually came with the fall of man. That when man fell, since man was the purpose of all of creation, when man fell, nature fell with him. There's an indication of this in Genesis, because if I'm not mistaken, there were no thorns and thistles before man fell in the Garden of Eden. That nature was benevolent before man fell. So when I see a cockroach, I think it's our fault. He came about. It's actually maybe my fault because I don't clean the house well enough, but it's also our fault as mankind because of the fall of Adam and Eve. We got all of this noxious nature. But most of nature is not noxious. And so let's look at it all. I have to give a saint's quote here. Saint Bernadette. You can learn a lot from Saint Bernadette, of Lourdes. My next show is actually going to be about Lourdes, by the way. A sister of Saint Bernadette, when she was in the convent, another religious sister, there were bats in the convent, and the sister was terrified of bats, but Bernadette wasn't. And the sister said to Bernadette, how come you're not terrified of bats? They're the very picture of Satan. And Bernadette said, no, only sin is the picture of Satan. Only sin is our enemy. It's only in sin that Satan actually makes himself present. Very profound statement. So these noxious animals are the fruit of our sin. But all we have to avoid is sin. And if you ask me, we're living in a cesspool of sin because we have allowed the illogical myth of evolution to take root and dominate our culture and the zeitgeist. And when we buy into theistic evolution, we are not resisting that. We are going along with that. We are saying blue pills are wonderful for you. We have to resist it. And the only way to resist the horrible influence of evolution is to point out its lack of a scientific basis, is to try to get other people to take the red pill, not because they believe in God, but because if you accept the premise, if you accept the postulate that God might exist, then you have a scientifically dominant alternative to evolution. That in order to accept that evolution makes sense at all, you have to base it on the postulate that a God doesn't exist. That is the point of today's show in a nutshell. So with that, let me go out with my welcome screen. Thank you for watching, and please watch again the next show whenever it may be in a few days. Subscribe to the channel, hit notifications, and you'll get notified, I think, if I understand how things work. Subscribe to me on Facebook and you'll get notified. Subscribe to me on Twitter and you'll get notified. So with that, is all good things come to an end. It's time to say goodbye. Let me give you the close screen and that beautiful music by Harpaday again. They'll be singing for us in November if you come along on the pilgrimage. I snuck in that second commercial. Bye for now.
Krishna.